So Mike Solana, editor of Pirate Wires, founder and editor of Pirate Wires, I should say. Um, this is Masters of Media, and it's all about people who are shaping the future of, I would say, not just independent media, but media more broadly. Um, and that's obviously you. I mean, who else is doing that if not Mike Solana? So thank you. I appreciate this. I know you're busy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Um, so I want to talk about everything about Pirate Wires. I've had the privilege of being a writer and editor there for the last better part of a year now. And it's really a unique place because for a few reasons. And I wanted you to talk about all these different reasons, but one of them is the brand. And the brand is just so powerful. I was talking to someone recently who was talking about one of our competitors, just like they like the reporting, but the way it presents, the competitor presents, doesn't have that feel that we have in that brand. There's something about the brand, there's something about the name, which in itself is a risk to use the word pirate
Yeah.
in a news outlet, but you did it. And then the other part of this that I want you to talk about is um, the way that you've grown it. And that's also something that's differentiated because I've had some experience helping to grow media brands. And what I've seen in the past is that there's this tendency to take millions and millions or tens of millions of dollars, dump it into the growth.
Yeah.
You get this massive initial sort of roller coaster ride up and then just plummet down eventually and crash and burn. So I think where we can start is just to think for people to actually understand the genesis and actually for me to understand it a little bit more fine grain because I don't quite have the timeline and that would be a good starting
Of
point.
Pirate Wires?
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to talk about the history of Pirate Wires. Because it is it has been the most rewarding creative experience of my life. And I think probably the genesis is June of 2020.
Okay.
Um, I had begun a podcast. So everything shuts down in I think March. uh, I began a second podcast. I was running the Founders Fund podcast at that time called Anatomy of Next. It's a show that I created and produce myself and host. I wanted to do my own. It was called Problematic, and the idea was I was just going to interview, quote, back then the word problematic was this word that people would use for just crime think. People who are
Right.
saying something, and
Right.
it would usually be applied to left wing. It was like people who were like center or center left who you liked, but they said something that was problematic. And it was just like a super dystopian
I
phrase.
remember it. Yeah.
Like it wasn't just, oh, right wing people are problematic. No,
Yes.
no, they weren't really problematic. Problematic is people who you're allied with who are saying the slightly wrong things.
Right.
So it was a podcast about that. And it was going to be my own, it was going to be a media company, but I needed some way to monetize it. And at that time, Patreon, the risk of being deplatformed on Patreon was actually extremely high. And so I thought, well, I need something else. I knew about Substack. I've been told about Substack from a few of my colleagues at Founders Fund. Very few people were on it at that time. There were people on it for sure, but
Hmm.
very few of the huge names that you hear about now were on
Yep.
it at that time. And I used it really just as like a monetization layer for what I thought was going to be the monetization layer of my podcast. And I thought, okay, well, it's a newsletter platform. It's not quite the right fit. They still had podcasting stuff there, but I was going to start a newsletter just to kind of sweeten the deal. And I was just going to recap the news. I've been writing forever since I was a kid, and I really enjoy it. And I had a lot to say. And right out of the gate, issue one of the newsletter, which was a way jankier version of what I'm doing now, it was really just me recapping, stringing together all of the major stories and commenting on them. That was just by the numbers way more successful than the podcast that I've been working on. And the second I knew I had an audience, and by that I mean like there were like 1,000 people by like week two or three, there were like 1,000 people reading it. And
How was that? How do you explain that? Because even early on, I mean, I was on Substack early-ish. I didn't have that experience at all. So,
latent, I would say maybe latent demand because I was writing so much on Twitter. So there were my Twitter growth had been growing a lot at that time, leading up to the launch of Problematic or the launch of Pirate Wires. And but even still, I mean, it was like probably less than a tenth of where I am now back in 2020. But people were interested enough to click. And then I think once they clicked, they liked it. And then it grew really fast. And once I knew I had an audience, I was like, well, I've got to be really good. And so I started taking it more seriously. I wanted to be funnier and more insightful, and I put more time into it. And they gradually of like kind of like clumped together into two big chunks, and then eventually became essays that I would release once every week on just what was happening in the world at the intersection of technology, politics, and culture. So the genesis was like, I got started, I saw an audience. I'd always wanted an audience for my writing. I'd kind of kept myself from being too honest about my political opinions in public up until then. I would hint at them and kind of try and poke holes at things, but I didn't want to be a professional opinion haver because I thought it would hurt my chances of successfully producing fiction.
Hmm.
Um,
It's a familiar story for me personally.
but I never had an audience for my fiction. And then
Right.
suddenly I did have a huge audience for my nonfiction. And it was kind of this thing where the moment I stopped censoring myself was the moment I found the audience I'd always wanted. And from there, it grew and grew and grew. I raised just enough money to hire people and get it up to profitability, which is where we are today at like a team of eight. And it's like it's now a profitable company, barely, but it's profitable with a big team. And in media, that's hard. And I think that's it's hard and rare. So
It's a it's extremely rare. I would almost say like it's not just that profitability is rare, but not having catastrophic levels of debt is actually quite rare in media because it is so hard to scale. It's so hard to keep an audience, to build an audience, to monetize an audience in media.
yeah, and that's become the trick now. It's like you mentioned the brand before, and I think that your brand is sort of in, I don't, maybe it's everywhere, but certainly in media, it's a promise that you're making to your readers or your listeners. You know, they can trust you on the following topics to come at things in a consistent way. Um, and if you break that trust, you lose, I think, pretty much everything. I think that like you can't repair it once you break it. So it's very hard to maintain. Every single day you run the risk of hurting that brand. And never really, it's very difficult. The brand is baked, right? Like it's very easy to hurt it and very hard to improve it at this point. In my opinion, I think because it's quite good, but like there are limited gains in improvement there, but like
Mm-hmm.
massive downside risk if you publish the wrong thing or
Mm,
take the wrong path. And so you have to just have a really, really high bar. At Pirate Wires, for me, the way I think about it is like, is this interesting? Is it important? And is it like fun? Is it good? Is it funny? Is it sharp? Is it clever? Is it dangerous? Like, does it make me feel some kind of like, oh, that's fucking cool
right,
that like we're doing that and no one else is doing that.
right.
And you kind of want to get all of those things. It's hard to do that every day, but
It's the I think the notion here is like to avoid that kind of meal, that mealy mouthed kind of slop that is just the content
yeah.
that's out there and is so much of what the media became.
Yeah, that's the probably it's always been that way to a certain extent. There's just this relentless demand for content, even in newspapers. Like every day, 100 years ago, every day you woke up, you had to fill the entire paper. It
That was
doesn't
the
matter if it was a shit news day or not. Like you
right,
had to fill the paper,
right.
and it just is what it is. So I think that's always been a kind of and just content in general is so different than software, which is like or even hardware. In software, it's like you create something incredible and then you scale it to everybody uses it and you're a billionaire.
Right.
In media, you have to create something incredible and new every single day, at least once. And if you can't do that, you die. And it doesn't matter how brilliant one essay you wrote was and how often people cite it 20 years from now. That's great as a writer, perhaps, but as a media company, that's not enough. So
Hmm.
it's very hard to do both. And I think you just have to. And that in terms of you asked how I think about growth, it's like nothing to me is more important than maintaining my reputation with my readers as someone who's not going to waste their fucking time. And so growth has to be, it's like, I want growth. We're going to grow, but it can never be at the expense of that. Like we can never just be producing slop. And the second that
Hmm.
happens, it's over. It's why even do it at that point? It's just, you've lost. So,
So, another question I actually don't know the answer to, which is why the word pirate? why the name Pirate Wires? Where did that come from?
Uh, Man, there were so many of so much of my entire life happened in 2020 because I felt like, well, I was actually alone. I was totally isolated in my place, living alone in San Francisco. And in the very early days, I didn't know what was happening. So I didn't want to see my family or friends. I didn't want to get anybody sick. I really thought about my family specifically, like not wanting to get my parents sick. Um, and I just was super isolated and kind of depressed and felt that the world was not even felt, the world was clearly collapsing all around us.
Yes.
Um, and I felt that the way the media handled it and covered it was, if not the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems. I
Hmm.
thought like that itself was the problem. And so trading in information as was becoming at that point, something that I was doing in a more professional way. Um, I just felt like a pirate. Everything was vibe based for me back then. Like I changed my profile picture on Twitter to Ulysses S. Grant,
Yeah.
like in the late 20 teens when everything was becoming more culturally authoritarian, leftist, and you couldn't really say anything, even roughly contrary to the sort of standard narrative at that time, which is hard to remember, but because things are so different now. But it was really, really stifling back then. And I did it kind of just emotions based, and it made me feel better on the internet to not have my face there anymore and to have it be this general who I really respected. And I felt braver because of it. And I started sharing my opinions more because of it.
Mm.
And that single change, which was totally random, marked all of the new growth on Twitter that preceded the
Oh,
growth
that's
at Pirate
crazy.
Wires. So moving forward into Pirate Wires, it was like, I don't know, the name just came to me and it felt correct. I felt like that's what I was doing. I felt like these were like forbidden or stolen. There's like stolen information that had been kept from people and I was liberating it and kind of like
Mhm.
sharing it with the world. It was just an energy that made me excited to write. And that is so much of what was important in those early days was just finding things that inspired me to write and to speak because I needed it because I was so depressed at the time. That I needed to be lifted out of that. And when there were things that made me feel good or excited, I would go to them. And that was like very much the name Pirate Wires. And it just became the way that I saw what we did.
So, at what point did you feel like this was starting to shape up as something that was more than about you? That Pirate Wires was now not just a brand, but actually a media company, which is like a big shift.
Well, that I remember there were people who are, absolutely enormous today texting me, asking me how to add new writers under your own name because they had never done it before. And I had done it pretty early on. I was like,
Mhm.
I have this cool platform. I want to share it with people who are saying great things or important things that I don't either have the time to say myself or can't say myself. Like I'm not as good at this kind of reporting or writing, but I value it. Um, and so we did a few of those, and I knew like just very, very, very early on, the moment I started writing, I knew that my ambition was to grow beyond myself. Um, I didn't want to be a famous influencer talking head with a huge like streaming show every day. Like I didn't want to be Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow or any of those people. And I'm not even this is not an insult. That's just
Sure.
that's an
Yeah.
important function in society or like an important role in media that seems so exhausting to me and not what I was interested in. I was
Yes.
interested in I wanted a team of people around me telling a much more important story. And I really wanted to eventually get to the place where we could be sharing the source material, everything in media, everything I was doing at Pirate Wires, myself personally, was writing about news that I was reading. But it was very clear that whoever was breaking the news was actually shaping culture, including the people like me who were, for the most part, contrary voices at that time. So the most important thing would be to be drafting, the first record
Hmm.
of the first draft of history. And that
Hmm.
comes from the reporting piece. That was something that I always wanted to support at Pirate Wires. Um, and by I think it was like late 2022, no, late 2023. I forget which one it is now. I raised money. It was just like, okay, we're gonna raise enough money for me to do this. I went part-time at Founders Fund for 6 months just to get it off the ground in a bigger way. Um, and so began like a year and a half of just a lot of trial and error because I had never run a media company before, and I'd never, I think no one has ever solved the puzzle of like, how do you extend what's working in the world of identity? We're in this world now, this media world of identity forward content. People are connecting with personalities who they trust and love and want to hear from specifically. They almost don't even care what you're writing about if they like you and the way that you say it. Um, or they do care, but it's almost second to that connection they have with you.
Hmm.
How do you turn that? How do you sustain a group of people on top of that who they don't know and maybe don't care about? And that was very tricky in the beginning. And publishing other people over my own list, I would be punished for that. And so immediately it's like, okay, well, you have to figure out a solution to that problem. And then involve for me multiple lists for doing different things.
Email lists.
Email lists. Everything is email in media now. That's where the war is for attention because that's the only place that independent media outlets and major media outlets, that's the only place they have that's a relatively free environment, not controlled by social media gatekeepers that determine where attention goes and for what reason on a whim.
Right.
Email is all you have left. And so everyone knows that who's working in media now. And the goal is like, how do I create something that people want to open? Because if your open rates decline, you're going to be spam and you'll never connect with an audience again. So that's where the war is. Yeah. So it was like, how do I create multiple lists to sustain something bigger than myself? How do we share the news? Is it aggregation? Is it original stuff? How do I work with writers myself? Especially, well, I won't get into everything, but a million things I learned. It was about a year, year and a half until I launched the daily when I felt like everything actually had clicked. I suddenly really felt confident about what existed and where it was going and how to grow it.
Mhm. Yeah. So the daily is our literal daily
Hmm.
email blast of three short pieces in it, and then we have our other content. Some of it's longer, some of it's only on the website.
Yeah.
So there's like an interesting dynamic that's between the longer, bigger pieces that are emailed, the shorter pieces that come out daily, and then the stuff that only lives on the website and goes out through Twitter. It's like a careful, like really calibrating each piece correctly so that it serves its right role within that
Yeah.
distribution channel.
You have here, no one wants to be a paid subscriber if they're not getting enough content.
Right.
But also nobody wants a lot of content. Everybody says it was Ben from Stratechery who told me this once. He said, everyone says they want um quality over quantity, but just by the numbers, it's very clear they want quantity. And yet they will, and this is not from Ben, for me, it's like, yes, they want it, but they will punish you for it if it's not great.
Right.
So it's like you actually just do need both.
Yeah.
And yeah, everyone has a different way of approaching that complicated puzzle. I've found one that works really well for me. And I'm open to changing it as things go. But right now it's working really well and it'll grow until it doesn't, and then we'll try something else and we'll kind of keep on moving that way.
So, Founders Fund is like a big part of your personal, professional story, and it's also part of the story of Pirate Wires. What was it about Founders Fund that you learned that enabled you to do what you do today? Like because it's pretty seamless. Like from Founders Fund straight into Pirate Wires, it's a very unusual story. Like you don't have a lot of people making that jump. Sometimes we've seen the opposite jump where people come from journalism
Yeah.
into venture, but you've done it the opposite way. So how did that, what was that like for you? And what brought you from Founders Fund into media? And what did you learn from that process?
Well, Peter brought me from media to founder. I was an editorial assistant at Penguin Books in my early 20s. I was 23 when I took that job. And my goal then was just to write fiction. And I thought I would take this job to learn how publishing worked and then just make a lot of friends and maybe one of them would publish my book because publishing was impossible.
Yeah.
There's like no way. It seemed to me at that age, looking ahead, knowing nobody, living in the suburbs of New Jersey. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a teacher. Like, my mom was an administrator at that time, but my dad was a teacher. Like, but we didn't know there was no path for me,
Hmm.
period.
Yeah.
So I knew I had to like get in there and just meet people, and maybe that was the way. But I hated publishing. It was like super stagnant, and some of the people were not, a lot of people were nice and they liked books and reading and ideas, and I liked that. But the industry itself just totally sucked, and it felt like it was dying, and it was a really
Yeah.
weird place to be.
Yes.
Peter was the opposite of that, obviously, and represented the opposite of that. He represented places that were growing and things that were exciting. He also was super into politics and philosophy and capitalism, specifically like anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism. We met through something called the Seasteading Institute, which was a nonprofit of his. They wanted to build politically autonomous cities in the middle of the ocean, which to me at that time, I was an anarcho-capitalist. I was a self-described anarchist. Was really important to me. That was just the coolest idea ever. I wanted to meet lots of anarchists. Yeah, we met through that, through my first meetup group, and became friends and got coffee whenever he was in the city. And he pretty quickly after that, I mean, I think it was only like a few months before he was like, I have this idea for something you might do instead. And that turned into like a year of interviews and then silence. And then suddenly I was working with him on a project that led to my job at Founders Fund. But what was it about Founders Fund that led to Pirate Wires? I think
Or what did you learn? Like what were you able to take from quite a lot of experience at let's say at least top maybe 1% or 0.1% of VCs in the entire world? What did that give you that equipped you to do something like this?
I think I think it there was first of all just this, and remains at Founders Fund, this crazy amount of almost reverence for people who start companies. And that's the culture of everything around me, is just watching people create these huge important things from nothing and also fail. You know, people fail left and right. People mostly fail starting companies, but all of the people who I had the most respect for had succeeded at that, including Peter. And I think I just wanted, I think I also saw how important it was to build companies to affect meaningful change in the world. It was a really good vessel for change, was companies. And and it was a long road at Founders Fund, watching all these people who were much better at something than I was, whether it was usually engineering based or um like science based. We had made a lot of investments in science companies back then. They had skills that I didn't have at all.
Hmm.
And so like the idea of me starting an AI company, that wasn't going to happen. Um, But then suddenly I had this skill in media, and people kept being like, "Where's the media company?" I had always wanted to start a media company. I just thought of it differently. I thought it was going to be a production studio. I thought maybe it would be a suite of podcasts, and I would do like maybe fiction podcasts. And then suddenly it was like this news thing. And I just knew in my gut that this was it. I just felt like, the ship had arrived for me, and it was very clearly right there, and it had a pirate flag on it, and it was mine. And I just knew I'd been sort of looking for it or waiting for it, and I just knew that this was it, and it would work, and I had to do it, and that was that. I just did it. So I don't know what I learned other than the path. The path to change is creating new institutions. You just
Right.
have to do it. You
Right.
can't complain about you just can't complain about the media. If you really care about it, you have to start a media company. And then to do that, you have to be today. I think maybe 100 years, maybe 20 years ago, you could have started a media company and not been a media personality, a writer, a
Right.
podcaster.
Right.
I don't think the world works that way anymore. I think that you have to be good at it yourself. And if you are, then you have this new opportunity. Perhaps it's still unproven. Generally, there are a lot of people in the sort of like Game of Thrones of new media right now, um, we'll have a better sense of what the lessons are, 10 years from now.
So within this Game of Thrones of new media and new media, one thing that we're starting to see is the dynamic between dissent and authority reemerge in
Hmm.
kind of a different way. So a lot of the new media that sprung up in the last 5 years was specifically dissent from the old media, because the old media was part of
Yeah.
the censorship infrastructure. They were the thing, not just what they said that was sort of allowed, but they were part of the process of clamping down.
Yeah. They took orders from the government, from their government. Then the social media companies took orders from the media.
Right.
It was like the blueprint.
But now we're seeing this question reemerge because, okay, now we've got a bunch of different new media companies, and we're starting to see something that looks a little bit like people vying to take the throne again of being able to to be the arbiter of what is allowed, what is acceptable in the discourse. And part of what your job is right now is negotiating that, because we don't, I, I imagine, I don't want to speak for you, but we're not here to be an authority figure. We're here to be credible. But it's starting to look like some other people kind of do want to assume the authority figure in the media role.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people just want to be in charge and they want to be in charge of the speech rules and they want to be in charge of the just the morality, what do you think about Ukraine or Russia? There's a right side and a wrong side and that's I've never wanted I've always kind of just personally spoke out of compulsion. I tried for a long time not to speak about what I believed. And then 2020 was really a kind of a breaking point for me. And I had to just, I started recapping and that became just like, oh, I want to say this. I want to say this. And then I said it. But that was never like, everyone should agree with me. Or everyone must agree with me.
Right.
It's just a lot of people happen to agree with me. And that was a strange thing. And now we have to navigate, well, what do you do with that? I think in terms of the macro here, first of all, the Giants are still giant. The
Yeah.
Atlantic, I didn't realize how influential the Atlantic still was until they did a profile of me. And that had a major impact on Pirate. It was like, whoa, they drove tons of subscriptions, tons of attention, far more than I ever thought they had. And I've appeared in all of the new media giant spaces and or many of them. And I've been on a lot of big pods, and
Yeah.
very few things had impact the way the Atlantic had. The New York Times clearly is dominating. They clearly
Yeah.
drive traffic. I think the difference between Tucker Carlson's influence before and after Fox News is really important. The lesson for me there is Fox News is still extremely influential, and you can say it's declining in influence, but people have been saying that for decades,
Yeah.
and it still seems like it's very
So
important.
you think Tucker, after he left,
I think he's far less influential now than he was while he was at Fox News.
right?
And so I think first of all, the first big piece of the puzzle is like those giants are important, and I think they're still more influential than a lot of the smaller guys like to think. I think partly the smaller guys think they're more important than they are because we all live on Twitter, and on
Mhm.
Twitter we're more important.
Yeah.
On Twitter, who cares about the New York Times? But like most of the country cares about the New York Times.
Yeah.
In fact, everybody writing on Twitter that the New York Times doesn't matter is sourcing their pieces from the New York Times.
Yeah.
I know I am. Like for me, it's very obvious that the New York Times matters. So those giants are still important. And on the news side, it's like they're clamoring for authority. And I think it's like, I think maybe wrong to do so. And then also looks kind of clownish because they're not. Like no one cares actually
Right.
what they think. Um, yeah, I think that's not there.
Yeah. I mean, the New York Times, because it's been the butt of so many jokes, we tend to forget that it has 600 million monthly unique
Oh
visitors.
yeah, no, they're the king for sure. Just also like really remarkable business. Um, Still like less than $9 billion valuation though, which is the really fucked up thing about media is that
Yes.
you can be shaping the world with your coverage, shaping the world.
Yeah.
which the New York Times is.
Yeah.
And they have not figured out how to do something more with their brand. I have ideas on what they could do. I'm not going to tell them. But they should be, they should be $100 billion company for the influence that they wield.
Yeah.
It doesn't. That's the tailwind, or one of the tailwinds that people in media are facing. It's just like, how do you monetize the attention? The attention is valuable, but much like airlines, Peter taught me this. Um, Airlines, there's like a not every company that produces lots of value is able to capture that value.
Right.
Airlines produce immense value for the
Right.
for the country, but they're locked in a brutal sort of zero sum competition where they're like eking out profit. It's nowhere near, what Google is making, just printing money out of the gate, like just can't help but make money.
Right.
I think media faces a similar, it's not quite as bad as airlines, but it's very bad. It's very difficult to capture the value that you're producing. Very difficult to even credit the value that you're producing. How many stories, stories become stories that are bigger than a news source. And people are not talking about, Axios in the context of Hunter Biden's dementia, though Axios really wants them to. You can see them like really, really, really trying to make this a story about them. That's not how
About
people
Joe Biden.
about Joe Biden's mental
Cognitive, right.
deterioration that I guess they were not a part of. Maybe they were just like these innocent victims all along and not perpetuating the stories themselves. But they're not a part of that story. That's
Right.
media. So even when you generate these important stories, or you're like really forwarding these important stories, they live beyond you in the sort of wilds of the internet and
Right.
in the information space.
Like
And
the better you do in telling a story, the less of the value you can capture as a media organization. The story transcends the single outlet.
yeah, there are just fewer. There could be a ton of people who have immense respect for your brand
Yeah.
and love you and think you're cool and want to be associated with you guys. Um, but they're not going to pay for a subscription to your outlet, or if they do, it's not enough, and the amount they're willing to spend is low. You're still not giving them a product, even though they have so much respect for you, and even though they benefit from you. Like, we have voting guides that we give out. We focus local politics at Power Wars. So we'll give out like a local politics voting guide, and people are like, "This is the most helpful thing I have." I give it to all my friends, and just by the numbers, they do very well for us. Um, People are willing to pay for it, but again, it's like not a lot. And so the question is, what else do you do with that brand? What else do you build? What does
Right.
that look like?
Right. A lot of traditional media over the last 10 years or so moved into like the event space. It was like this
I
brand
know that's
extension
the
thing.
easy. Everyone wants a conference.
You're right.
Um,
Do you think that's still relevant? Do you think this is something that can actually still make money?
Listen, people love a boondoggle, and you're always gonna be able to make money on a big party. Um, Especially when you're reaching out to people in tech who can expense it. But it's not my quest is to find the way, you know, it's the path of Disney. Like, how do I actually capture the value of this brand?
Hmm.
And it's going to be bigger than talking about the news. It has to be for me personally. But I never had the ambition of just being a writer.
But
So
what does that mean bigger than talking about the news?
I mean, Walt Disney World is much bigger than Steamboat Willie, or, a bunch of Steamboat Willies.
Hmm.
He succeeded not just in a short cartoon, and then not just in a 3 or a 7 minute cartoon that was thematic, which had never happened before, and then not just in a feature length animated film, which had never happened before, and then not just in a whole studio of them, and then not just in Disneyland, but in Disney World, where he died. And he would have kept going if it wasn't for that. He was always expanding beyond it. Like, you have to create the form, keep it running, and I think move on. And in that way, Disney was really good in that he created content and then like realized it in the world.
Yeah.
And I know that that's like sort of, maybe it's a little ambiguous or open ended or something. I just know that that's he's the only guy. when I think about inspiring people in media, there's only one of them for me, and it's him. I have a
Hmm.
lot of respect for what the New York Times built,
Yeah.
but not nearly enough. Like for me, it's Disney.
So that's like a different set of values that are in operation where from a Disney versus a New York Times. Because the New York Times, at least in theory, the value is journalism, it's accuracy and all that stuff. Whereas for Disney, it's not quite that. It's including that. I mean, at least in your model of that. But there's something, a very different value driving, or what drove Disney was something very different than that. I mean, so
Well, Disney wanted to change the world.
in what way
He
though?
wanted to
For
make the
what reason?
world, he wanted the world to look more like his fantasies about the world. And that's what he set out to do, is to like shape the world in accordance with his views. And I think that's a very good North Star and maybe the only thing that any one of us should be doing, regardless of whether or not you're an entrepreneur, right? Like you should be trying to do, I think, maybe not. Maybe it's fine to just be working a 9 to 5 and you just get enough money to like live on the weekends and that like have a nice life. That's actually fine. Most people are that, and I think that is fine. And they're happy with that. And that's great. No one should be
Hmm.
forced or feel like compelled, oh, I've got to go prove something or whatever. But if you do feel that way, if you do feel like I need to do something bigger than myself, then I think that what you're actually trying to do is you've identified there's something about the world that you think is broken or should exist, and you want to fix it or make it happen. And reporting on it is not ever going to be enough.
Yeah.
So that's where you have to start and you have to keep doing it, I think. But you have to always have an eye ahead and trying, you have to be trying to do more. And you have to keep growing, not just within the medium, but into new mediums and new kinds of business and new kinds of partnerships. I just want to try and find the thing that I watched happen again and again and again at Founders Fund was people would reinvent a business that used to exist and they would do something that could never be done before, but now could happen. And because of that, everything changed.
Hmm.
And I don't think we've
Yes.
seen that yet in media. In fact, the current paradigm that is working, which is if you want to call new media, was surfing for attention on giant social platforms. And that seemed like it was going to be super disruptive until Mark Zuckerberg was like, I'm pulling this lever that shuts off all your free
Right.
traffic. And then
Right.
they all fucking died.
Right.
New media is about creating distribution channels yourself
Yeah.
through mostly email lists. And that uh, is really a lot like a newspaper. That's a lot like you've got people who are selling your newspaper in stores across the country, and you've
Right.
got
Delivered to your
trucks delivering
doorstep.
them and like paper boys throwing them,
Yeah.
and you have a list of people who have your subscription. And that's really what the new model that's working is an old model. It's older than the last model. And it just is really actually maturing online. And the people who championed that were the New York Times. They're the ones who were like, we're not doing all this other bullshit over here. We're charging for our subscription and online, which seemed unthinkable at the time. And there were some other people as well who were doing similar versions of that. It was like you had Jessica Lesson at The Information doing a tech version of that. Before her, you had Ben Thompson from Stratechery again, who was like, these are early people to the format. But again, it's an old format. And what I'm looking around now at is sort of what can we do right now that we could never do before? And I'm trying to figure it out. I don't have all of these answers, but I just know that they exist. And I know that the only
Hmm.
way to survive is to find it and do that. This can only be the first step. If
Hmm.
you want to build something really remarkable, a really sort of generational or generation defining company, you have to find that thing that you can only do now that you couldn't do before. And then you have to ride that into success.
That's very interesting. And I say that as someone who feels the same way intuitively. Like the notion, I think there are amazing journalists who are like, I'm a journalist. Like, this is what I do. I go to
Yeah.
work, I write journals, and they're incredible. They do great stuff. And some of them are not incredible. That's their job. Like, okay, fine. I personally, that's just not how I feel in about what I do. I think that it's the core of it, but that there is about something, putting something into the world and creating something. This is why I'm doing this right now. Um, that is much more interesting and impactful and rich on a level of your personality, your soul in a way. actually.
Yeah.
But when we think about like what you were saying about creating the thing that had been created but could only be done really now. I was actually listening to Palmer Luckey talking with Rick Rubin about this idea of how he created Oculus.
Mm.
And it's not because he was the first to think about it. It had been around for before him for 50 years. It's just that he was the first to have access to computing that enabled him to do this on a software level, what had previously been done
I've talked to
on a
Palmer
hardware.
myself about this. And did he explain in the I didn't see the Rick Rubin thing. Did he explain about the the sort of VR winter?
A little bit. He talks a bit about it, but what
It's
you
such a
t
good
tell
example, and I'm
us
glad you
what you
brought it
what
up because it was really important. There was a huge hype wave, VR hype wave in the 80s.
right,
And it people believed it was going to be the future. And the reality is the technology was not even close to there.
right.
And the experience of VR following the hype made you feel like VR would never happen. And then the technology didn't improve right away. And people came to believe that VR couldn't happen. They just
Hmm.
internalized this idea that it's like, it's not
Hmm.
there, it's not good, it'll never be the future. The future vision was sort of wrong.
Yeah,
Um, and so it died and it went away. We entered the VR winter.
right.
And many, many, many years later, Palmer pops up and is like, wait a minute, but like the technology is so different now. We actually can do it and it can be really, really good. And so there he was, and he put it together, and the rest is history, really, for him. Well, that was the big. I think in a way, that's what I believe is that is actually not the end. That's like the beginning of Palmer's story. Is
Yes.
that is that that that
Right.
company, for all of its success, for as remarkable as it was
Yeah.
technologically, and then in terms of just impact across the rest of the industry, in terms of the financial gains for him, he goes to Facebook. The Facebook buys it, of course, and that changes the trajectory of his life. Uh, but then he's fired, and so begins, I think, the
Yeah.
real story. When people will write Palmer's biography, and they will, many people will, um, it will not be about Oculus. Will be like not a footnote. It will be, the first chapter in that book, and
Yeah.
the book will be about something much more ambitious and important.
Right. It's like the
And
appetizer to whatever the main course
he was a
becomes.
kid, and you see this remarkable success and
Yeah.
intelligence in a kid, but yeah, he's now a man, and he's doing much more ambitious things that
Yeah.
are much more impactful, I think, and are actually incorporating a lot of what he learned through his work at Oculus.
So, I think about that because in the Rick Rubin interview, he talks about his shift in VR was being able to do in software what everyone else had done, tried to do and failed to do in hardware. And like that's partly because he's brilliant or maybe a genius, but partly because the software and the computing was there. But when we think about media in a sort of analogous way, thinking back to what you said, the old becomes new because the technology changes and because we have Substack and because you don't have to physically deliver a newspaper to somebody's door or even with a website, you you couldn't really do what you can do now with Substack, which is to monetize on an individual level as someone as one-to-one monetization. Mike Solana gets one subscriber to pay him. Like that was impossible before the Substack or the Substack modality.
It
It
was just
was,
much harder. Substack made it much easier. And because obviously there have been versions of the paid thing before that
yeah,
have been bootstrapped by the Times. Again, then the other examples like Ben Thompson's
yeah.
and Jessica Lesson's, those are all pre-Substack, far pre-Substack, but very few people would jump up and do a version of that. And
But you
then
couldn't, you couldn't even in those cases, you couldn't have a single subscriber. That was impossible. Like on Substack, you could actually have one subscriber
yeah.
and you'd still be technically making money.
Yeah.
Like you'd be profiting from one person. It's
Yeah.
one-to-one subscription, which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, Substack really is. There are so many things that are amazing about Substack. I mean, Substack also, the technology is really good. The design is really good.
Yeah,
The integration of the CMS with also your email distribution,
yeah,
the tracking of data, the payments thing, they are kind of just they're like the Apple computer
Hmm.
of uh of media company software,
Right.
and have nothing but just love for them being a huge part of where my journey began. Because obviously I went to Substack first before I built our own site.
So within this sort of extended metaphor about what becomes old becomes new because of a shift in technology and also because of personality, where do you think this is going to take us? You know, if we kind of abstract away from Pirate Wire specifically, what do you think? Where does this go? Because I personally, I think I used to have more of a pulse on where media was going a bit more than I do now.
Yeah,
And I really now I'm at a point where I'm like,
it's
I
chaos.
can't really tell
You
you.
can't tell. It's just it's noise in every direction. It's total chaos. That is just what people at, millions of people online sound like, is chaos. And
Right.
everyone on social media is now producing information. And so the information ecosystem is really chaotic. What emerges from that is not, it cannot just be chaos. Like what I believe is the average person, what happens is they just retreat from online spaces, or they
Yeah.
retreat from the pure chaotic pulse of where it is. And what they do is they go looking for people who can make sense of the chaos for them.
Right.
And so I think the future of just media, straight up, like you are running a media company, your job is to distill that chaos into signal and be like, this is what you need to know. Yes, there's this war of anime fairies with communist like flags in their bio and based Greek
Yeah.
statues and Pepe
Right.
frogs and like soy jacks, and they're this like brutal
Yeah.
like all versus all war.
Yeah.
But the takeaway here is it seems like our president has dementia, and probably a bunch of people are in charge right now who are not elected. And that's what maybe we should be talking
Right.
about. Or in the case of, gosh, am I going to wait? I'm not going to wait into tariffs right now. My point is that your
Yeah.
job, I think that what will continue to happen is the average person, of which there are hundreds of millions in America, we're not the media. They're not the media. What's going to happen is like we're the media, and
Right.
that doesn't mean giant institutions anymore. That means like you can do it. You decide that you want to make your life this, and you can do it tomorrow.
Right.
But like that person who says, I'm going to be the person who's distilling noise into signal,
Yeah.
um, they're going to be speaking to audiences of millions of people. And they're going to be ultimately speaking for those audiences when it comes to time for politics and things like this, which I think intuitively we've all understood always to be the case. But it's no longer siloed off into the giants, which are, themselves controlled by a very small group of elites who like all live within miles of each other in the wealthiest regions of the world.
Mhm.
It's going to be a wilder mix of people now representing millions of people. And I think that listen, I'm very biased to be like, this is all going to be great. But I think there will be downsides too. I think that there are always trade-offs in every shift. And I think that we are in the middle of a major shift. I think the New York Times, before earlier I said, Fox and the New York Times and the Atlantic, place like the Atlantic, extremely influential. I think that influence might remain steady. The competitors will grow and increasingly represent,
Mhm.
again, millions of people. And what that looks like, I don't know. I mean, there's a version of me out there who believes very different things, some of which I believe to be totally antisocial, terrifying, dangerous. Um, and
Meaning
that's
a
the way I'm
version
at.
of you, someone who's creating a news outlet, who's becoming a distiller of noise into signal, but with values that are
Yeah,
opposite to
you
yours.
see this on like the dirtbag left, you could call it.
Yeah.
These are guys who were sort of like anti-woke,
Yeah.
communist, like straight up. And I think that's the future of the left for sure. I
Yeah.
think it's going to be hugely powerful. It's being ignored and suppressed in a lot of the same ways that the populist or nationalist right was ignored or suppressed. And it appeals naturally to the left base. I mean, they are fundamentally statists, like
Yeah.
communists. adjacent. Like, how many Democrats do you know who aren't willing to be like, listen, I see where Marx is coming from. Like, it's a huge threat to the center left.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be the trend on the left.
It's what you've called the Luigi left.
Yeah, the Luigi left for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is it is dangerous. It's so polarizing, and their enthusiasm for violence is
Yeah.
just
And it's extremely charismatic. It's
yeah.
really important that he was attractive. It's
Hmm.
really important that all the girlies are like, I want to get fucked by Luigi. Like, that's crazy. Like, you can't buy that.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not astroturfed. Those people are real and they exist on the MAGA right as well. There are plenty of MAGA people. When I was
Yeah.
first covering Luigi, like, there were tons of right wing people who were into it. They were like, I see where not all of them were saying based like Hassan was, but they were really understanding where it came from. And I don't think there's any stopping stuff like that. There's just how are we going to live in a world with stuff like that
Right.
being much more influential? Because the thing about centralized media or close to centralized media, monopolized media, it led to things. Um, let's see. I think right now we would never have another Vietnam. It would be so difficult to do Vietnam because everybody would be furious. There are so many outlets to talk about it now. Back in the 60s, you had a couple of places where the news was being disseminated across the entire country,
Hmm.
and those places were captured by the state, and we were in this very kind of like it was a sort of one party state esque
Yeah.
environment at that time.
Yeah.
That's over. The centralized media has ended. And so, yeah, like Vietnam might never be possible. But also, what stops to happen is like in the 60s, there was much more of a cohesive sense of national identity. You know, everyone was sort of watching the same things and believed in the same things. And that meant for a much more, I think, copacetic country, that stuff's going to go away as well. It's like we might not be able to agree on things like Vietnam, but that also means that we can't really agree on everything. That's the place that we're approaching now. Don't have the solve for that. That's just what the technology has given us.
Right. Yeah. This so in the 60s, I read a biography of Kissinger by Neil Ferguson, and you see that the debate between the left and the right regarding communism was that should our nuclear strategy be that we like wipe them out with 1,000 bombs or with like only 100? Like that was the primary debate,
Yeah.
right? Whereas today, that even having that consensus framework, it's unimaginable.
Yeah.
Like and it really does feel like we're not coming back from that. But how do you? Because when I come back to the U.S., I don't live in the U.S. When I come back to the U.S. and look around and I wonder to myself, what is it? Like, what is America at this point? What connects people to each other? Really? Is it just a word? Is it just like these few syllables? Or is there something else that makes America what it is still today?
Well, I mean, I think I felt the same way in the UK when I visited. I was like, is this place just an accent? Like, that's what it seems like. I think America too. I often wonder, what I say to myself is like, I want to be a nation, not an economy. And I think about that all the time. I was thinking about that. Literally, I was staring at my window yesterday in Miami, and I was thinking that there are people who are coming here to be a part of an economy, not a part of a country.
Yeah.
Um, and the answer, got it. I wish I wasn't so pessimistic about this, but I think the reality is over the past 3, 4 decades, there has been so much, not only on the one hand, there's been so much immigration, there has been so much, um, I think, concerted effort to challenge or deconstruct the national identity, to rewrite history. There has been so much moral inversion, which reached its zenith in 2020, I would say, where you not only criticize the good, but you frame the bad as the good. That I don't have much of a sense right now of what the national of what it means to be America.
Yeah.
I have a sense of who I am as an American and what America means to me.
Hmm.
And, I'm going to keep fighting for that. But there's just been a lot of damage done. And I think
Yeah.
now it's like I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how I'm ever gonna break bread with a Luigi leftist.
Right.
Like or how, the congressional version of us would sit down with the congressional version of them and achieve
Right.
anything close to like a compromise for like an infrastructure bill.
Right.
How does that happen? They
Like
don't
an AOC and
agree.
an MTG.
How does that happen?
Yeah.
Right. Like how is that? Well, I wouldn't call MTG like the version of us.
Well, let's say the caricature of the farthest pole
Yeah.
on the right, and the caricature of the farthest pole on the left, even though she actually may not be the farthest,
Yeah, I mean,
you
I
could
think
still go farther.
yeah, you could, and they will. They're
Yeah.
going to find the leftists that are going to go further.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was watching a woman, um, Jackie Fielder. She's a district supervisor in San Francisco for, I believe, District 9, the Mission. And she just won. She's batshit insane, total communist, actual, like, sort of philosophically Marxist. And she, like, she's never we're never going to have a rational conversation with her about something like housing, which was what she was in my feed talking about. She was opposed to a building that had been built um, at market rate housing, just like which means just you build a building and then you sell it to people. And she was opposed to it conceptually. She didn't want to build it at all because it wasn't going to low income people. It wasn't being set aside artificially by the government or built by the government to only go to poor people. This is not a woman. That is not the kind of that didn't exist 50 years ago. There were people who had ideas maybe like that, but in government, they were trying to get shit done and maybe couldn't for whatever reason. But what you
Mhm.
did not have was a non-trivial number of people in government who were opposed to like the concept of people building and buying houses in their city.
Yep.
And that is just how do you navigate? I don't think that you do navigate that. I think that maybe the way this all concludes is with some kind of new government system that is reflective of the new medium, which is possible. I mean, a lot of what we had previously was reflective of new technologies like the printing press and things like that. I don't know. I think that we're entering a period of, it's clearly a period um, of people finding their representatives in media. I think those people will grow. I think it will be chaotic, and I think it will probably conclude in some new way of doing things that we're having a difficult time conceiving of right now.
So if you think, if you imagine that there's someone out there listening who's thinking, I've also thought about starting something, or they've had an idea to do something in media, or they wanted to write, or they wanted to have their voice heard, but they haven't had that opportunity yet. What would you tell them to do? Like, what would be the first smaller step, achievable steps to get themselves on a pathway?
They should write. Yeah, they should just write. And nothing matters more. You can just write tomorrow. I always, when I was in Brooklyn years ago, when I was at Penguin, there were all these people in Williamsburg. I lived in Williamsburg, which is like the capital of hipsters, or it was at the time. And everybody wanted to be a writer. Everyone was like, had this ambition to, I'm going to be a novelist or something.
Yeah.
And I was like, because I was writing back then. I didn't have an audience, but I was always writing. I was always writing teleplays and screenplays and short stories and novels. I wrote a couple of novels back then. Um, th- I was like, but you're not writing. Like, what are you talking about? Even while you're a writer, but you're not writing. You have to write a
Mm.
lot to be a good writer. And
Yeah.
in media today, I don't think if you want to get started, you have to just get started. And that is like, I mean, the game, my media is saying shit about the world. And you just have to do that. And you have to find people who care about that. And once you find people who care about that at all, you can scale it. And I think that's the trick is maybe people don't realize once you have any success at all, it's really, really hard to do that. Once you have any success at all, there's a
To scale it.
very good chance you can scale it. Um, a lot of this I didn't think about ever while I was doing it. It just kind of, I just did stuff. I had kind of a high level ambition, but I just did stuff at each crossroad. In hindsight, it's very obvious that like once a handful of people connected with me online, the rest was almost inevitable,
Really?
provided I pushed and wanted to go there.
So I that's an interesting point. I would not have thought that would be the dynamic. I mean, I can imagine someone getting some traction, some audience, and some reputation, but scaling it seems to be like orders of magnitude harder than building the initial. That's what my estimation. Maybe I'm wrong because I've never done it, but
Maybe because
that's my impression.
now it's like it's this is less about building a media company and more about how do you get large amounts of people to care about what you're saying.
Right.
And there, I don't know that anybody, maybe someone does. I don't have an answer to that.
Right.
I just look at the world every day and I say, that's fucked up. That's fucked up. That's cool and could be really cool if we did the following things. We should fix this over here. What we really need is this thing over here. And people connect with that or they don't. And I think that's just for how I think of my own work is like it has to always just be that.
And that is something that comes from a sense of faith in yourself, right?
Yeah.
To be able to say to yourself, like, okay, I'm actually, it takes a bit of a leap, you know what I mean? To say, I have enough wherewithal, experience, and knowledge to decide this is bad, this is good, this should be something we cover, this is
Yeah, I
something we
guess it
shouldn't
is like
cover.
super arrogant in a way.
I don't think it's arrogant. I think it's something else because it's something that is hard. Arrogant is easy,
Yeah.
but actually doing that and doing that consistently and doing it in a way that actually lands for the audience, that's actually hard. And I mean hard in an emotional level. I don't
Well,
mean
it has to strike people as true too, because so much of what has worked for me is just putting words to a thing that is happening accurately. That's always my biggest best pieces is when I'm
Mm.
like, here is the trend.
Right.
This is a trend.
Right.
Everyone has already known it. I'm never saying shit that no one, maybe I'm saying things that people haven't considered before, but I'm not making stuff up. I'm looking at real things that are happening in the world. I'm trying to contextualize them, analyze them, and I'm saying, listen, this is what I think is happening, and this is what's going to happen if we don't do the following things. That's people connect with that,
Right.
and I think they especially connect with it now because they've been lied to for so long. What it means in the future. Now we get this whole marketplace of people saying shit, and they
Yeah.
can, make you they can speak words to anything that you want to believe. So I don't know where it goes from here, but that's what's worked for me.
Which is almost in a way what you're doing is giving people sort of a heads up display. They're looking at the same reality, but you've layered on
Oh,
all this
right.
other like information to decipher it correctly, to
Yeah.
guide them.
How I see it, like this is yeah, exactly. Like you knew about right now I'm writing about planes. And it's like, okay, you maybe have had a really rough couple of years with flight delays. And you saw this thing about, at Newark Airport, maybe the air traffic controller said it's not safe to fly. And there was that crash in DC. What's happening? Like, what's actually happening?
Right.
And that's where, you know, I say, here's what's actually happening. Here's what I think the real danger is. And here's how we fix it, things like that. And where does it come from? I don't probably, I mean, I always feel like my sense of right and wrong is well beyond it's like comes from above. Um, Sometimes I feel like I'm an antenna and I'm just like receiving instructions. Maybe I am. I don't know what the details are there, really. I know that I trust, I know that I trust my sense of right and wrong, and I definitely don't trust um most of the people who've been in charge because you can judge them by their fruits and it's
Yeah.
like a fucking disaster out there.
Yeah.
And so what's left to trust? Like we got to try something different.
Right. It's like a changing of the guard,
Mhm.
basically. The old are definitely out. The new is not yet in. We're in that kind of in between,
A
which is
lot of yeah, it's beginning. The fight is beginning.
yeah.
As people become more popular and the stakes grow, I think it's going to become maybe more obvious who the leaders are.
So I think on that note, I think everyone here knows where to find you. This is one of those moments where you say, "Where can people find you?" I think we all know. But on X, it's Mike Solana,
Yeah,
right?
MIC Solana.
MIC Solana and Pirate Wires, pretty self-explanatory. Piratewires.com to subscribe. I think we still do. You can subscribe to the daily
Yeah. You just hop on that site and you'll get a prompt to subscribe. And
Yeah,
from there, there's a whole host of newsletters you can subscribe to.
amazing. So, thank you. This has been, again, for me, like I didn't know a lot of this, so this has been great for me to learn, and it's been great.
Yeah, great talking to you.
Thanks. Cool, man.